Hi everyone, this is an introductory PowerPoint, a brief one, just a couple slides, this title slide and one more, in which I'm going to lay out the overall theme that we're exploring this week of the 1920s as a time of clashing cultures, intense cultural conflict. The 1920s, one of the most racist decades in American history, the worst race massacre in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre, happened in 1921. We'll talk about that subsequent PowerPoint. Conflict between science and religion, urban-rural split, hostility toward immigrants, things that are very familiar because they're all ongoing today. These were all part of the conflict of the 1920s. And in the next slide, I'm going to quickly go over some bullet points that relate to this overall theme and try to show you what I mean when I had on the syllabus that the 20s was a time of conflict between an emerging modern America and many Americans' concept of more traditional America. So here I have this laid out in the second slide, the left column, traditional culture, and the right, modern culture. This list could be much longer. These are just some key things that I see as part of distinguishing between these two cultures that are conflicting with one another in 1920s America. You look at traditional culture first on the left. Historically, Americans had emphasized the idea of production, particularly after the American Civil War. The United States became more industrialized, and the United States was one of the, for example, leading steel producers for the entire world. Well, by the 1920s, that began to shift, and we're going to explore this as we look at some examples of advertising, consumerism and commercialism that became very much a part of American culture in the 1920s. So you see this shift in the 1920s toward emphasizing consumption, consumerism. It's a movement away from the old Sears catalog of the late 19th century and the 19-teens that you looked at to find a product because you needed it. In the 1920s, American companies and the advertising industry began to promote the idea of buying something simply because you wanted it. Why have one automobile when you could have two? Why have just one wristwatch when you could have two or three? Why have one radio in your house when you might have a radio in multiple rooms? The idea of purchasing something because it was going to make you more sexy, more desirable, more hip, more cool, all the sorts of things we've been bombarded with in our consumer society today, these all really begin to emerge in the 1920s. So this is an important shift from the idea of emphasizing production to a greater emphasis on consumption and consumerism. Historically, traditional culture had emphasized character, you see here in the second point. And I was exposed to this in a variety of ways growing up. Things like the completely made-up story about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, his father confronting him, and Washington saying, "I cannot tell a lie, I cut down the tree." Completely made-up story, never happened. But it reflected this idea of kind of idealizing famous characters in American history and emphasizing the idea of character, honesty, for example, integrity. In the 1920s, as the whole concept of celebrity begins to emerge, there's greater emphasis placed on personality, a lot of larger-than-life personalities. George Herman Ruth, dominant baseball player of the 1920s, completely transformed the game of baseball. Babe Ruth, as you know him, just as well known for his personality as his accomplishments on the baseball field. And this is another aspect of the more modern society that starts to emerge in 1920s America. If we go back to traditional culture column on the left, you see religion as the third point. Americans in the 1920s, and this is true for many Americans today, think of the United States as a religious nation and trace this back to the arrival of groups like the Puritans. Well, in the 1920s, there was greater emphasis and interest in science, and many people saw science as a threat to traditional religious beliefs and values. And this played out in the famous trial of John Scopes in Tennessee, and that's the trial we're going to talk about in another PowerPoint. Next, traditional culture. And I referenced this when we talked about character in the story about George Washington. It tended to idealize the American past, romanticize it. We still do a lot of this today. Many Americans are reluctant or outright hostile to the idea of confronting and learning about some aspects of American history. Well, in the 1920s, there was a tendency to look more toward the future and what it held and the promise of the future, which reflected the growing modernity of the country. 1920s is the first time in American history, if you look at the 1920 census, where we have more Americans living in urban areas than rural areas. And so the United States is becoming more urbanized, and this kind of looking to the future along with greater interest in science reflected that. The next point, traditional culture was local culture. Prior to the invention of things like radio or the phonograph and records in the 1920s, just to take live music for an example, the only way you'd hear live music is if people in your family played instruments, somebody in your community, or if you lived in a rural area in the nearby countryside, if there was somebody who played instruments where people got together to hear them play, that would be the music you knew. You wouldn't know what was going on musically in New York City or New Orleans or Chicago or even Kansas City, say if you lived here in Missouri, unless you traveled there. Well, in the 1920s, with new technologies like radio, like the phonograph, like the first records, Americans all over the country could hear the same radio programming. They could listen to the same music. So it's not an accident that you have this exciting new musical form emerge in the 1920s, jazz music, which many traditional Americans found objectionable. And it's a product in part of mass culture, and it's an example of something where everybody had access to it, provided you could afford something like a phonograph, like a record. Most Americans could afford a radio. Not everybody, but mass culture begins to supplant and become more prominent than local culture. And the last point, very important, is that traditional American culture was white and Protestant. And what's happening in the 1920s is that American culture is becoming more diverse, more multi-ethnic, also more multi-religious with the arrival of new immigrant groups. And I'll mention this in another PowerPoint coming up. But immigration patterns to the United States shifted in the decades after the American Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, most Americans, or most immigrants who came to the United States, came here from Northern and Western Europe. You had Scandinavians, Brits, Scots, Irish, French, German, and after the Civil War, those immigration patterns change, where larger number of immigrants are coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. You get a lot of Slavic immigrants, places like Poland and other Eastern European countries. immigrants from Greece, immigrants from Italy. The overwhelming majority of these immigrants were Catholic, not Protestant. And this is going to be a key element used in the ideology and the propaganda of the Ku Klux Klan. It's an organization that was intensely anti-Catholic, and that tied in directly to the Klan's anti-immigrant stance as well. So these are some key elements when you compare traditional culture with modern culture that exemplify this conflict that's happening in the 1920s, and we're going to explore some of these themes in greater detail in additional PowerPoints that I'll be posting.